Oh, hi everyone. Thank you for having me here, especially during this time of chaos with the fires. My heart's really gone out to people and creatures who've been suffering. I'm going to talk about something a little bit lighter, feathers. And I'm hoping that my talk about feathers is going to leave you with a new perspective on feathers and birds. Okay, where are we? Oops. Feathers complexity as a covering beats any clothing that we've ever made. And sometimes a nervous speaker is counseled to look at their audience in their underwear, but I don't do that. But I like to look at you and imagine that you and me have come to this earth evolved with feathers. And if you can imagine yourself like that, you would be modest. You could use your feathers for display. They'd be warm. They'd be your clothes. And if we had feathers, we wouldn't need all the clothes that we have. They'd be our homes. So we would be able to not have as many houses. And if they could help us fly, we wouldn't need the cars and roads that we have. But they're appropriately viewed on the bird because that's where they evolved. That's where they're the most beautiful. And just like you and I are made out of the food we eat, I just ate some corn soup, which was really good, and it's going to go in my body and become my cells and eventually be my bones and muscles and skin and hair. Same with a bird. So if you're walking along and you see a robin feather on the ground and you pick it up and you're holding it in your hand, you're essentially holding worms that have been reconstituted into a feather. And a robin will repurpose its worms into long chains of fingernail-type proteins called keratin. It's the same stuff that our skin's made out of, our hair, our fingernails, a bird's beak, a bird's claws, and a bird's feathers. And the thing to know about keratin is that it's one of the toughest of animal materials. We think of feathers as being delicate sometimes, but that's a mistake because they're light, and maybe we think then they're delicate, but they have to be strong to be on the bird and do everything they do for the bird. Unlike something I read on the internet, feathers don't grow in feather beds. People give me feathers all the time, and these are turkey feathers. They weren't the perfect ones, so I put these feathers in the garden, and I just had fun. I planted them, but they never grew little feathers or roots. But I did dig them under the soil, and they become the soil. My plants, the kale in the background, take that up, I eat it. So perhaps in some way these feathers become part of me, and now these feathers are talking to you through me. I made a couple words. How about if we think of a feather that's just starting to grow, we call it a feather. It has a single artery and a single vein, and that provides nutrients into the growing cells at the base of the feather. And then when the feather is grown, even those little spots on the feather that you see, those are dead, like our hair. The structures have been made. They don't need to be live cells. And then when the feather's fully grown, then that artery and vein goes away, and like our hair, it's dead. And then it performs its functions on the bird, like warmth and flight, everything it does for the bird, which I'll talk about. And then they're shed. And then I take these shed feathers and I'll carve them and make art out of them. But I really don't think that feathers can be improved on by art. They're so perfect. They've evolved so well and complex that we can't improve on them. But my art, I hope, can give a little bit more meaning for us. So feathers have to grow, and on most birds, they grow fairly quickly so that the bird can keep flying and do what it does. But like on a peacock, the big display feathers can take 6 months to grow. And that's from a tiny nubbin until the artery and vein goes away. And if it's pulled out, then a new feather will grow again. But if it's cut, it just stays there until a new feather that's growing after its molt, they'll push those feathers out and then grow new ones. And when a feather's grown, they're 10 to 20% of the bird's body weight. And doesn't seem like very much maybe, but those feathers are light. It's a huge bulk. I was at a bird rescue place in the Carolinas, and somebody gave me an owl to hold, a big great horned owl, and they were holding the big claws, and this bird's about like that big, and I held it, and my hands went up to its body. It's really skinny. It's all bulk. All that bulk is feathers. And each flight feather can more or less sort of be controlled by a muscle and a tendon so that the bird can respond to the needs of flight. And in order to give you somewhat of an idea of maybe a little bit what it's like for a bird to fly, at least a part of what it's like for a bird to fly, I would like to ask you to do an exercise with me, pretending we have finger feathers. And we'll be flying in the woods with our finger feathers out, and we're going to slow it way down because a bird can do this fast, and this is our first time. We've never done it before. So if you're willing, hold your finger feathers out, and we're flying along straight ahead, and we're keeping those steady because we want to go straight, but there's a tree in the way. So move your little finger on one hand just to veer off a little bit and avoid that tree. Up, then there's another tree is coming up, and so switch. And switch again. Like everybody's going back and forth. You can feel how that taxes your brain a little bit, right? And a bird does this a lot faster, just fast. And they have more than 5 feathers, and they have like 10, or depending on the bird, but they have a lot more. And they're not just doing it in 2 dimensions, they're doing it in 3 dimensions. So for me, it gives a whole other meaning to the term bird brain, and it gives me more respect for the bird just to know that they can do incredible things that we can barely imagine, and it makes me think maybe I'm not so superior to these creatures. But flight's only one of the many advantages of feathers. These are from capercaillie. It's a big, giant grouse that lives in Siberia and Northern Europe. And they have to be warm. And you see the vein is what it's called, the top part of these feathers. That's what you see on the bird, but below, that's all downy warmth. I live north of here, about, I don't know, how far is Seattle from here? 2,000 miles or so. And we've been getting frosts in the morning. The first frost that I got at my place, I went out of my door and I had a short sleeve shirt on and just short pants on, and turned around right away and went back inside because it was cold. And I put on some long johns, I put on pants, I put on a sweater, coat, a hat, and went back out and was relatively warm. And then I looked up in this tree, and there's this little songbird that's just looked pretty content, just sitting there, and I was a little envious because all it needed to do was go poof. But all this downy warmth doesn't work at all if those feathers get wet. So birds have several ways of dealing with that, and one is pretty obvious. They're like shingles. The rain just runs off. But they need more. And so microscopically, as the keratin is forming, little bumps form on the surface of the feather that acts in the same way as when an ant falls in a puddle. The surface tension doesn't let it go through, and that's the same thing that these bumps do. So you could take this feather and put it in, let's say, a glass of water, and you'll see a silvery sheen on that surface of the feather where the water isn't getting to the feather. Yeah, notice the bright green on this feather. Feathers have color in two different ways. One structural and one is pigments. And the structural colors are often shiny. And for this green, it's reflecting, it has little grooves in the feather, right on top or just under the surface of the feather, that when the light comes through, it's reflected in a certain way, and the width of those grooves are the exact width of, for instance here, the green, the wavelength of the green, so it shines it right back. And when this feather's turned, so that shine doesn't come right back to you exactly, the feather looks brown or gray. You don't see that green. The most common of colors is melanin. That's what most birds have. There's russet reds and browns and grays and blacks. It's the same stuff that's in our skin that makes our skin so varied. But feathers do it one step better because they have patterns on their feathers. If we had patterns on our skin from melanin, that would be really cool, I think. This is all melanin. And if you look after the show, there's a piece right here with this bird's feather on it. And it's my favorite bird for the patterns in its feathers. And mostly the patterns help a bird hide. When it goes into the forest, it disappears. But this bird also has these big long feathers with the eyes, and it's like a peacock, except it's not its tail, it's its wing, and it goes up like that. Its head goes down, and it's a beautiful display. And so this is my favorite bird, like I said, for the patterns on its feathers. And I got so obsessive that I found the whole English alphabet plus the numbers on it and made this poster. And I like it, but I thought I could do one better and make it out of color. So I thought of the bird, what kind of bird would have a lot of color? So I started with the parrots, and I looked at one parrot, and I noticed the feathers they're pretty much just, if they're colored, that's the color they are. There's no patterns on them. And so I looked at about 100 species of parrots and then more other birds, and I didn't find very many patterned colored feathers. I did make a poster, and that might look more colorful, but if you look at the top row, that's all melanin colors. Most of those are melanin colors still. And what I figured out was maybe what ornithologists already knew, that patterns, they help a bird hide. And if you're going to have display feathers, why would you dilute that color with patterns? That's my theory, at least. I found out the hard way. And then, besides melanin, there's the other main way that birds color their feathers with bright colors is through a class of chemicals called carotenoids. So think of carotene, carrots, and it's from what the bird eats. So they'll eat fruit that have these compounds, or other kinds of plants, like flamingos eat shrimp that have eaten these plants, and they have their bright colors. And there's at least one kind of bird that metabolizes copper into its feathers. And I love this turaco feather it's coppery to me. That looks coppery. It has blues and greens also. And they live in sub-Saharan Africa that has a lot of copper in the soil. The trees take it up and they eat the fruit from the trees and make these colors. And I heard somewhere that this, probably on the internet again, that these colors are water soluble. So I wanted to do a little experiment, and I took that feather and I put it in a cup of water, and what do you think happened? It came right out because it's waterproof. It just floated right out. So I mushed it all up and got it so that surface tension wouldn't be there, and I put it in the water and left it overnight, and I came back and the water was clear, which was, I like that because I can't picture these birds like dripping red wet on their first rain. But I did put some soap into the water and put the feather back in, and immediately this beautiful color came out, and the feather turned gray, and the water looked like cranberry juice, which I wanted to drink, but I didn't. So I have these ideas that these feathers are the bird's covering, and they protect the birds from bumps and scrapes because they are tough. But so I think of these birds walking around in like armor, but feathers also enhance the bird's ability to sense its environment. Like for instance, flying. If my arm was a feather, this would be all dead. I wouldn't be able to feel this. But the shaft of the feather, the center of the feather, is embedded into nerve-rich tissue in the body, and it's a lever. It enhances any kind of anything that touches it. So a bird can respond to the slightest currents of flight, for instance. I took a series of photographs of feathers and what those birds eat. So I was for this one, I took these 2 center tail feathers out of a Gila woodpecker I found dead on the road in Baja, and got a whole bunch of grubs and put it behind, and that's the picture. And I'm showing this picture because feathers molt. I mean, birds molt their feathers. And so there's the birds, when they molt their feathers, it doesn't take a lot of energy to just drop a feather, but it takes a lot of energy to grow back 10 to 20% of your body weight in feathers. So they do it at a time of abundant food, hence that picture. And they shed for their big flight feathers, they shed them evenly because they don't want, if there's one that drops out of one wing, they don't want to be flying lopsided. So pretty soon afterwards, the other one will drop out. And until the next set drops out, they grow back about maybe halfway at least, so the bird can keep flying, getting away from predators, going to eat. So we have these shed feathers, and now it's a good time for me to talk about the legalities of having feathers, because there are laws that I need to abide by, and it's good for you to know. It might be a surprise for you too. Over 100 years ago, there was really kind of a dot-com boom in feathers because of fashion for women's hats. And they would put whole birds on their heads and just lots of different kinds of feathers. And the fancier feathers were even in more demand. And I heard a friend of mine who wrote a book called Feathers, Tor Hansen, he found that on the Titanic, when it was coming over, when it sank, the most valuable cargo was feathers. They were worth way more than their weight in gold. So if you had a shotgun and some shells, you could make some money, and you could really clean up if you could find all these birds, the fancier bird, or one people fancied were fancier, in one place, and could shoot them all and get a lot of feathers at once. And people started noticing that there were less birds. There were less, like egrets was the one people talk about the most in the U.S., but this was happening all over the world. And so they started lobbying our Congress and legislature for laws that would protect these birds, and they were successful. It was really the birth of the conservation movement. And now we have the Migratory Bird Act, which means that you can't kill birds for their feathers or their meat. Most migratory birds, there's some exceptions which I'll talk about, and you can't have them, and you can't have their body parts, which means you can't have their feathers. So if you're walking along, like I was saying, and pick up that robin feather, and you're holding these reconstituted worms in your hand, that's really technically you're possessing a feather. That's from a migratory bird. And it's a broad law, like a lot of laws are, and a lot of people have feathers in their altar they don't know, but it's a good thing to know about. And it's also like if you're driving along and it's a 50-mile-an-hour zone and you're going 51, you're probably not going to get busted for it. And the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service that enforces this is they have usually probably have better things to do. But it's good to know about. Which brings me to, well, where do I get my feathers? People can still hunt birds, and turkeys, for instance. I can have wild turkey feathers, and I use them a lot. I also use a lot of domestic turkey feathers because they're really cool. There's a lot of these are domestic turkey feathers that have cool patterns and different melanistic colors in them. And I get my feathers from zoos and private aviaries, mostly. And these are from birds that are not from North America, but the zoos and private aviaries are in North America. So if you think of all the parrots that people have, and most of them, if they're not endangered in the country where they're from, I can use them and sell them. And also the the pheasants. There's like 55 species of pheasants, and most of them are in zoos in the US. So now I'll talk about my art. People ask me, why did I choose feathers? And I have a couple of reasons for it. And one is in visual art, like writing, we're trying to capture an essence, something of the essence of life. And if I was a painter and I start with a blank canvas, I'm creating that from scratch, or a lump of clay. But I start with a feather that already has some of the essence of the bird that I'm trying to portray. So I feel fortunate in that. I kind of start ahead of some other artists, but that's really my only advantage, really, because the feathers, I want to respect the feathers for their form and size. I don't color them. The only thing I do is cut them. And they're only a certain size. Like each of these pieces here is basically the feather dictates the size of the piece. But doing that, I have to be creative. So sometimes limits are incentive to be creative, to get the meaning, the unity of design that I want. Another reason that I use feathers is that I want to fly, and I can't. And I think I share that with probably all cultures in the world. We can't fly in our bodies, but we see these birds soaring, and we want to do that. We want to get away, and we want to fly. And so feathers take on the symbolism, and as do birds, of flight, of escape, of transformation, of bridges between here and heaven, of achievement. So it's really important to us to have these symbols and make meaning from these symbols. And I like to remember, though, the first time someone sent me a picture of my art tattooed on them, it really enforced how important this symbolism is for people. Because if you're going to put it on your body for the rest of your life, that feather that probably means something. And I did look up, I did a little research about feathers and tattoos, and there's a lot of people who have feather tattoos, men and women. It's funny, though, that the men seem to have more peacock feathers, just display kind of feathers, than the women did. It's the viewer's mind that creates meaning. It's us. It's not the birds themselves. The birds are innocent participants. These are not big-breasted love demons or heart-lipped faces or deer hoof prints. These are patterns on a sharp-tailed grouse that helps a grouse to camouflage. So the feathers they're innocent participants in our need to make meaning. I get my inspiration from a lot of sources, and chief among them, or first among them, was my mother, because she was a professor at one point of art, and then she got married and had us kids and quit that, but she kept doing her art all her life, and she did oils, she did watercolor, and then she ended up doing sumi painting, which is a Japanese method of capturing the essence of nature, of life, in simple brush strokes with just using charcoal and water. So she died, and I got her sketchbooks, and I found this little sketch, which is about this big, about like an inch big. And I wanted to honor her, and I loved this image, so I carved it in a feather, and I really don't think I did. It's not brush strokes, it's different. It took me a lot longer than the minute it took her to do this. The most important to me artists that inspire me are the artists that have been with us for at least 95% of our time as humans here on Earth, and that's the Paleolithic. Before we had cities, when we lived in more smaller tribal communities, and we were very much more aware of the animals and creatures that we depended on and were around us. And now we're still surrounded by animals and creatures, and that's us. And so most of our art is about us these days. And so I want to keep doing birds. And I did this piece from, this was a stone petroglyph that was from the Columbia River Gorge, and when they made the dams, they moved some of these out into a state park along the Columbia River. And this one looked like an owl to me, and so I stylized it in a feather and made it with the light shining up as if it's a campfire, but not a camp, it would be your home fire, I guess, sitting around. Yeah. And another major source for me are the birds themselves. And I love to go bird watching, and sometimes I'll go with people who are just saying there's a species and then go on, there's another species. But I like to watch them more and just sit and watch them. And I was in the u.s.a mountains at 11,000 feet waiting for my friend, just sitting in this glade for like 5 minutes, just staring at it, just seeing what I could see. And out in like 5 minutes, and then I saw out pop this grouse. It was so camouflaged. And then a few minutes later, these little babies started popping out and started running around. I made a movement, and they're all like, poof, they're gone. And I like it when I can make an image out of the feathers of the bird I'm trying to portray. And these are ruffed grouse feathers. So I went home and I made this piece. I really kind of strongly recently realized how much movement inspires me. So because I think it comes to this kinesthetic feeling. I have all these barn swallows in my barn, and I watch them when they come in the spring, and I feel my whole body going up with them when they fly, and then down. And I think it came that maybe, I don't know if you're born with something like that, but I think for me, I can trace it back at least a little bit to skiing. I would ski and go down these moguls or whatever, and I'd get a little air just for a second, and then bam, back on the ground with these long, heavy boards on my feet. And now I like to dance, and it's a lot easier to do than going skiing, and it's a lot freer. And I hope that this feeling of movement translates into movement in my work, but also I think it also gives me a sense of space. and design in some way. So as I said, birds are my focus. Every once in a while I go off and do something else, and I thought I might be doing a whole bunch with people, birds and people like this one, but I never really did that much with it because I think I can say what I want to say through just birds usually. And when I'm making a piece, I don't hit people over the head with meaning. I don't even really know what this means to me. But I did take this to a fifth grade class in Brooklyn, and one of the kids said, well, what does that one mean? And I said, well, what does it mean to you? And I got like 30 different really cool answers. It was really surprising what they come up with. So that's one thing I like about being an artist is how does it affect you? So I spend a lot of time choosing the right feathers. And these feathers are, as you can see, there's some blue. That's the structural color, and they're shining at you. Some of them, but some of them aren't at the right angle to shine at you. And so they're not blue, they're a darker color. And then I've made this template so I can put the pieces on as they need to go. And here they are getting laid out. They're all loose on there, so I have to be very careful of my breath. And then the final piece, they're all angled toward you. You can see the reflections just right now. Since all feathers curve, front to back, side to side, I like to respect that. I want to respect the feathers. I partly just love the natural world and feel like I'm part of it, and I don't want to paste these feathers against their background and flatten them. So by doing that, I've raised them about a centimeter, a couple centimeters, half an inch from the background, and by doing that, and by respecting these feathers and doing that, they've given me something that's integral to my art, and that's shadows. So each piece will vary according to the direction, the intensity, and the quality of the light that shines on it. And it's a lot of close work. I wear magnifying glasses. These were my father's because he did eye surgery. And the picture's pretty accurate, except for one thing. And remember about blowing on the feathers and them all going away? And one errant breath can just destroy hours of work. So I'll wear a bandana in that situation. So as I said before, it's a very human quality to need to make sense of the world. And we do it in a bunch of different ways. We do it through science. We make sense of the world through religion, through myth and story and symbols, and we make sense of the world through art. And if feathers are going to be important symbols to us, we're going to be using them as symbols and in our art as long as we and the birds are here together on this earth. This is the last picture I'm going to show you of birds, a bird feather, and what that bird eats. This is a long-legged buzzard from North Africa, and it eats mice. I got 3 dead mice and put it underneath these feathers, and then took the picture and then put it in Photoshop, and, well, truth be told, I put little sparkles in their eyes. And I'm showing this for a reason, because it's a little bit harsh. And living is harsh. When you're born, it's a guarantee you're going to die. And we have to kill plants and animals in order to eat, in order to live. And we kill plants and animals indirectly, just in order to get here today, in order to have our homes. So it seems harsh, and part of me cries out for some gentleness in the world, and feathers do that for me. Admittedly, they the birds have to eat and kill in order to live and grow these feathers. And then they dead on the bird, and they do these wonderful things on the bird, and then they're gently shed, and yet they retain their beauty and their complexity. So I hope that you'll leave here today and seeing feathers in new ways. The feathers, they're a gentle reminder of the cycle of life, and they're gifts from the bird. Thank you. I'm happy to hear your comments, take questions.
Question.
Yeah.
So they're ephemeral, but they also can last for a long time. What are the variables on that?
So the question is, if I can reframe it, it's like, how long do the feathers last, and how can they last?
Yeah.
Or do they just dissolve? There are mites and stuff that eat them, but they're made out of keratin, and if they're, what I do is I freeze my feathers, and I make sure there's no mites, because birds have this whole thing. I just read this article. It's called the pterosphere, the whole ecology underneath the feathers, where there's mites and there's creatures that eat the mites, and the mites eat parts of the feathers, and is important to the ecology of the bird. It eats like skin and stuff. But they do eat feathers if they're just sitting there. And if it's dry and it's not a place where they would like to live, they'll last forever. I mean, they find them like up in the Andes that are 500 years old. Mine are all, they're sealed, and the feathers are clean and frozen beforehand. Yeah. Yes?
So the feather weight is a composite innately, right? It's made up of much smaller pieces to make the whole. And do you make use of the spine of the feather to create the integrity for the piece to stay together? I mean, the individual piece, you cut it out.
So
how do these little tiny pieces stay together?
Okay, the question is, how do these tiny pieces stay together? I think. So the feathers are whole. They have a shaft.
Yes.
They have barbs, and they have little barblets, like little branches and little hooks that keep them all together. And if I cut them, especially the vein, the flat part of the feather, they can stay together, but they lose their structural integrity and they kind of flop around. So I have a process of backing with paper, glues, and pressure that I've developed.
Talking about transportation and storage, how do you store all of the free birds we see?
How do I store all this installation piece where they're not under glass or plexi? So when this comes down, it'll go home, and I'll put it in the freezer for 48 hours at 0, and just if they picked up anything, and then I have them in little boxes, and they're closed. I found where I live, there's moths that get into them that could. And I found that if the boxes have a lid that goes over it, the moths don't get in, but if it doesn't go over it and there's any opening, they'll go down into it. So I put it in boxes like that, but in the boxes, I put a little bit of flea powder. Yeah, which is, it's a chemical. It's not. I don't really like to use it, but it definitely makes sure that nothing gets in it. I think the museums these days, they used to use carbaryl a lot, and I think they've kind of gotten away from that, and they just freeze. Yeah, if they notice anything, they just put it in the freezer.
I guess visualizing, I would think you would be stuck in some kind of foam core.
I do, yes. I stuck these are all on entomology pins. I have a background in entomology. These are on entomology pins, and I'll just stick those pins into polystyrene or something. Yeah. Yes.
When you cut the shapes of the birds, I'm assuming you just do free form, like freehand cutting.
Okay.
You don't have any kind of a, I don't know what you could use anyway,
Yeah.
a pencil or something that you.
I'll tell you my process
Okay.
of how I get to cutting the birds. So I'll have the feather, and I back it, and I'll also have my drawing of what I want to do on that feather, and I'll refine that drawing, and then I put it on the computer. I take a picture of the feather, put it on the computer, and size that and refine some more to that size of that feather. Then I have a template for cutting. Yeah. Thanks. Yes.
Do you remember the moment where you were looking at a feather and you thought, I can cut an image out of this?
Yeah. So how did this come to me? This idea of cutting the feathers. Do you remember feather, and feathist? Remember the feathist one? They were little dots in the feather. They looked to me. They weren't just dots. They almost looked like they were little birds trying to fly out of the feather. That's what inspired me. That was the first one. Yeah. Because I was doing photography of feathers for like 5 years, and then I was playing with feathers and trying to arrange them, and even under glass, but there wasn't that much I could make much meaning out of that. So I was really glad to find this way of doing it. Yes.
Oh, I was just wondering, quilters, they always save their scraps. I wondered if you save your feather scraps and if you've done anything with that.
Do I save my feather scraps? You see my feather scraps all over here. So yes. Yeah. Oh, yes.
So most of these likely it's just two-dimensional. Will you ever try to cut off and make it into an object like three-dimensional?
So you were saying these look like they're two-dimensional. Can I ever do it more three-dimensionally? And I see these as the feathers themselves as three-dimensional, somewhat, because they do curve, and I don't paste them flat. But as far as a big three-dimensional sculpture, I've done a couple things, but no, not really. Yeah, I haven't. Yeah, that's kind of exciting to think about, though. Yeah. Yes.
Are all your feathers from ones you find and people gift you, or do you have other sources where you actually have to purchase them from breeders or?
Yeah. So where do I get my feathers, and do I pay for them? There's a lot of gifts. I do get a lot of gifts, and then others. I think if I have an idea, I have a lot of feathers at home, but often it's even if I have all those feathers, I just can't find the right one, and I'll go to somebody like a turkey breeder, and I might buy feathers off of a turkey breeder, even though they mostly just give them to me. There's a couple feathers like this big Argus. Remember the Argus pheasant that with those eyes? There's one right here, and those I paid a man in Alabama for 25 years. I would get the molts from his 7 birds. He would just send them, and I'd give him a check every year. And then one day he called me in tears, and he said all his birds had been killed by a weasel. So I don't do that anymore, but I have a lot of feathers still to work from all that. Yeah.
Do you have a, sorry.
Did you had your?
Oh, yeah, are different feathers like different thicknesses, or are some easier to cut than others? Or like, are they different,
Yeah. Okay.
different kinds of materials?
So how the feathers are? How are the feathers different, especially in terms of working with them? The shaft, the bottom shaft of the feather, like I don't know if you can see this one, but the barbs come out, and they're kind of like I-beams almost that come out from the feathers, and right at the shaft of the feather where the barbs come in, they're thick and harder to cut, and then towards the end and out towards the edge of the feather, they're thinner and easier to cut. So there's differences, and there's difference between different kinds of birds and different places they are on the body. Because some are really, turkey feathers, the tail feathers are for display. They don't have to be really thick like a tail feather or a wing feather. That has to be a little bit more sturdy. So there's differences, yes.
And what is your cutting tool?
Do you want to?
Sure, I was just
Oh,
going to ask you, like, if you ever have any, you see pictures of, certain birds and you wish you could work with those feathers and you try and somehow source the feathers, but you can't find them. Do you have that?
Yeah, finding really cool feathers and not using them.
Something like that.
There's a lot, yeah. So there's a lot of feathers that aren't legal to use, and some of those are really beautiful, but I don't use those. I'm fine with that. I have this idea of if I wanted to travel, I'd want to time travel and go back, millions of years, and see what kind of birds there are, what kind of feathers they had, because we have what is it? I don't know, 10,000 species of birds. I don't know, something around there. But that is about, from what I've heard, or what scientists have said, it's like several orders of magnitude a difference in what they estimate how many birds there have been, but we are only at a very small percentage of the birds that have ever existed. I can't just imagine all the different kinds of feathers that there have been. Yes, you were asking. Oh, you were asking about the what I use to cut them. I use a surgical scalpel. Yeah. Replaceable blades. Yeah.
Just want to know
Okay.
how you clean them. Besides freezing, how do you?
Yeah. Soap and water.
Cool.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah. Well, thank you. Thanks for your questions too.